This presentation is brought to you for Central Dakota Ag Day, which is being held virtually in December of 2020. Today's topic is making good quality corn silage, and it's being presented by Karl, Hoppe, Extension Livestock Specialist, located at the NDSU Carrington Research Extension Center. 2020 was a unique year for producing good quality corn silage. We had an early frost in the first part of September, which led to varying degrees of termination of the corn crop across North Dakota. In the Carrington area, most of our corn crop was frozen off, and of course that usually starts the dry down process with silage. And the important factor with making good quality corn silage is having adequate moisture in the corn silage pile. Again, corn silage moisture content is an important part of making silage. If it's too wet, it won't ensile correctly. If it's too dry, again, it won't ensile correctly. If it's just the right moisture, between 62 and 67%, it'll produce a nice fermented quality product in the pile. If moisture is greater than 70%, you'll probably see leakage coming out of the corn silage pile, and that's where it seeps off to one particular area of the pile. It might seep into the ground, but usually the ground seals over, and the moisture will drip off to the lowest part of the area, and you'll have a river running out of the corn silage pile. If it's above 80% moisture, it's a pretty good chance there'll be some pretty funky fermentations going on, and it may even rot. So that's the reason we can't have too wet of corn silage. We need to have the correct moisture. On the other hand, if it's too dry, we do run into silage that has a brown color. Throughout the winter, it'll keep heating, and quite frankly, it doesn't really go to completion in the fermentation process. Oxygen can still get into the pile at some rate. The fermentation never does actually produce enough acids to pickle it and cause it to stop. You'll have a brown colored silage that cattle will just aggressively eat. But whenever you're having respiration or continued fermentation in a silage pile, you're losing nutrients. So having the adequate moisture content is very important. When to chop silage is a difficult decision. And in areas like North Dakota where it can frost early, the answer to when to chop silage is going to be soon thereafter that first killing frost. As soon as the plants start drying down, if we're using corn grain type varieties, those varieties dry down rather quickly. They're bred to be that way. If we're using silage varieties, they tend to dry down a little bit slower. So it's important to know what type of varieties of silage or varieties of corn you're chopping for silage, so you know what the moisture content can be or will be when you're needing to chop. In reality, most people hire somebody to chop silage, and so custom silage chopping is widespread across North Dakota, and in reality, you chop silage when that particular silage chopper shows up. So if it's early, you're going to have some wet silage. If it's late, you're going to have some drier silage. We do have some variability that happens inherently in a silage pile. We're chopping several thousand acres, and like a dairy would have, because that's a mainstay of their ration for the dairy cows, and they can only chop maybe 10 acres an hour with a chopper, maybe 20 acres an hour with a chopper. You can see, so 2,000 acres would take quite a few hours and several weeks to chop. So inherently, there's going to be a time frame throughout there where the silage might be drying down, or if we have a rain event, it might stretch out to be more than 2 weeks getting the silage pile chopped. So inherently there's going to be some differences in moisture content from the beginning of chopping season to the end of chopping season. I always encourage people, when have the opportunity, please use a kernel processor for making corn silage. Basically, the knife, after it's been fed into the silage chopper, the knives chop it to whichever length you prefer to have, 10 millimeters, 8 millimeters, 5 millimeters, whatever the case is. Then ran through a kernel processor, which is basically a roller that squishes the silage and busts up the kernels so they're processed. And you will see most kernels are damaged when they're in the silage pile. And one of the advantages to this, and if you're feeding calves with with feeding calves corn silage, they'll tend to sort out the cobs unless they've been processed with a kernel processor, which break them up readily and can no longer do the sorting. A lot of times we can't get around from harvesting corn silage and we end up chopping it too dry. What do we do then? Well, one thing is to try to increase the chop, make a finer chop, decrease the particle size. Hopefully that'll pack better in the pile and be able to exclude out the air when we're packing. Use a kernel processor again. It'll break things up and hopefully cause the fermentation to start quicker and get the pile to ferment. We could add water. That's another opportunity. Although I've only been in one pile over the past decades in North Dakota where they've actually added enough water to raise the moisture content from 50 up to 65% moisture. And it did take actually 2 weeks for this person to do this with a garden hose, moving a sprinkler back and forth, and it was only on a small area of about 20 acres. According to my notes here, you'll see that 10 tons of silage from raising it from 55 to 65% moisture will take 700 gallons of water. Well, a semi truck may hold 15 to 17 to 20 tons of silage. You can see that'd be 1,000 gallons of water for every truck that's being dumped. Again, not very practical. Could be done, but definitely should be a slow soaking going on instead. You can add additives that promote aerobic stability. In other words, a buffered propionic acid. You could add that to kickstart the fermentation process. You could use certain bacteria that might help. In a dryer, be sure to use a liquid inoculant if you're using inoculant when it's really dry. All those things will help when we're harvesting too dry. Silage inoculants cost $1 to $2 to $3 per ton of silage. They can be expensive, but you can smell the difference in a silage pile. And while our wild varieties, our wild strains are in the field, silage pile will ferment on its own because there are bacteria and microbes floating in the air that'll land on the pile and will turn into fermenters. We can kickstart the whole thing by using silage inoculants. Don't try to dust it on with a bag on top of the pile. That just doesn't work. It needs to be sprayed on, preferably in the forage harvest chopper. There's different strains of inoculants. Most of these will probably have a couple different mixes of strains. Some strains produce more lactic acid, which drops the pH, which makes it more acidic and stabilizes the pile and runs it to completion, the fermentation process. Other bacteria will produce more acetic acid, which when you're feeding the pile will keep the pile fresh and works quite well. Sometimes these inoculants might have what's called an oxygen eliminator. Basically what it does, it tries to scavenge the air that's in the silage pile, so it forces the pile to quickly move from respiration over to fermentation. Respiration is where it uses oxygen. Fermentation is when it's in a without type air environment or an anaerobic environment. And that's what a silage pile is all about. It's about fermentation and producing acids and pickling the pile so it'll keep. It's always good to cover a corn silage pile with plastic to reduce spoilage losses. There's different types of plastic sheets. There's oxygen limiting sheets. There's the black plastic. Maybe a good settlement would be to use a 2-ply plastic sheet, one that keeps the moisture in and the other one that keeps the oxygen out. So oxygen doesn't permeate into the pile and create some losses. I think you'll find out when you're dealing with beef cattle producers, if you have the option to put up the silage too wet or wait a month and put it up when it's too dry, you would rather put it up wet, and you'll find out that'll make a better quality silage for you. Most silage choppers, they usually say, we've got our customers, and if you're a new customer, you want to chop early or do you want to chop late? And if it's late, it will probably end up being drier than it should be to make a good quality fermented corn silage pile. If you do miss that window for making corn silage, you do have other options. You could just snap off the ear and make high moisture ear leach, or you could actually make high moisture grain corn and grinding it into the silage, grinding it into a pile and packing it that way. Yearly should be 30 to 40% moisture. High moisture grain would be 28 to 35% moisture. There are other options if we can't get to the silage early enough to create a high moisture silage product. One thing when you're producing silage, be sure to pack the pile completely. If we don't pack it hard enough, if it's too dry and we can't get a good pack on it, we don't cover it, we'll see a higher level of mold in the top of the pile. That should only be a couple inches. In this particular picture is probably a foot, and that can easily happen in silage piles that are put up too dry or not packed hard enough. Putting on a cover along with tires so the cover doesn't blow off in the middle of winter certainly will keep that pile around throughout the feeding year and through the next summer and until the next silage crop is produced. Some people ask if we can feed a silage pile right away after chopping. Well, the answer is you can. You really haven't made silage at that point. So in reality, the silage pile needs to go through a fermentation process and shouldn't really be disturbed during that period, because if you disturb it, you're going to put air into it, and air leads to a respiration type rather than a fermentation type microbial growth. So it takes about 7 to 14 days for the acids to be produced by the bacteria. Things will keep on going longer in the pile, even up to 2 months before it's really stabilized. And if you're feeding dairy cows, you would certainly wait that time period before you open up a new silage pile to feed the cows, dairy cows. Beef cattle are a little bit more resilient, and you'll just see some differences in intake, which may change performance of the cattle. But one comment here: digestibility of corn silage can improve even after months of silage. So it's important to test a silage pile when you first open it up, as well as a month or every month or several months into the silage feeding process, just so you know what is coming out of your silage pile for feed quality. Fermentation has many different phases. Let's just go through this slide quickly and say, initially, when we pack it into a pile, we'll see an increase in temperature, and it goes from room temp up to, say, 90 degrees for a decent fermentation. If there's too much air, or we can see it actually go even higher, 100, 110 degrees Fahrenheit. But when we're doing that, we're losing nutrients due to the bacteria producing that amount of heat. So your pH will drop, become more acidic as the bacteria go through the fermentation process. And you can see at first the temperature raised, and then it decreased, and then we have some lactic acid formation. Temperature will maintain itself for a while. It'll be stored and will actually feed quite well until we get air infiltrating the pile, and then at that point we can see some more mold and yeast activity going on. That's usually why when asked if I can move a silage pile from one location to another, usually not, because you reintroduce oxygen into the pile and it needs to be fed rather immediately after you take it out of the silage pile. In other words, within the day. If there's one thing that you could do to encourage learning more about your silage pile, that would be to take a thermometer. Now, this particular thermometer is a 3-foot long composting thermometer that's stuck into the face of the silage pile. So that temperature is actually 36 inches into the silage pile. This particular silage was chopped in November of 2019. It was below freezing when it was chopped, and it was put into the pile as frozen feed. And you can see what the temperature is, and it actually remained that way throughout the winter as frozen feed, and didn't actually ferment until the outside edges got warm enough to start fermenting in. But for the most part, this was actually just frozen, fresh chopped silage that was fed throughout the whole year. On the other hand, in 2020, silage was put up a little bit sooner. You can see that the color of the silage has changed. You no longer have that green. This is the outside color, so it has a little bit of weathered look. A little bit of that happens because of the heating that comes out from inside the pile, but this particular, you can see it's 82 degrees. This is in October and November, that now that pile is at 100 degrees, so you can tell fermentation is still going on and gives you an idea of what's happening in your silage pile. If you did a good job of packing, hopefully the temperature will be lower, and it'll work. So in summary, Good silage starts with healthy corn plants. If they've been frozen before you chop it, you're just going to have more of a challenge in putting up your silage. Please put it up at 65% moisture and pack, and pack again to get to exclude the air out of the pile. Use inoculant if it works for you. Cover the silage pile immediately if you can. I know a lot of people in North Dakota don't do that, but if you're in Wisconsin or further states south where it's warm, they definitely see the advantage to not having silage spoilage loss from not covering a silage pile. Check the temperature to know where your silage pile is doing, and then be sure to feed enough of your silage pile to keep a fresh face on it so it has a nice silage smell when feeding the cattle.